Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OTD Military History. Today, we are going to be shifting focus a little bit. Lately, it's been a lot of World War II stuff with the 80th anniversary of 44. So a lot going on there. To look at a World War I topic. Happy to have Nate Hendley on today to talk about his book, Atrocity on the Atlantic, Attack on a Hospital Ship During the Great War, which covers the sinking of the hospital ship, the Llandovery Castle, which we'll get into it, but was carrying at the time its crew and medical staff from the Canadian Army across the Atlantic to pick up more wounded Canadians to bring them home. And then there's a whole bunch of other things going on connected to that other than just the sinking of a hospital ship. So sorry, we're a little bit behind here, so we'll get right into it. Hey, Nate, thanks for coming on the channel. I really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, of course. It's good to have this topic on because obviously that was a big part of your book, which I read, which was great, about getting this story out there. So with that said, I'm kind of wondering, how did you get to this story and why did you decide to write this book?
I got to the story in kind of a roundabout way. I've always read a lot of history, especially military history. I'm a journalist. I'm an author. I've written about a dozen other books, mostly in true crime. But I'd never heard of this case.
Okay.
And I do, however, write articles for the website of TVO Ontario, tvo.org,
okay. Yep.
Sort of usually historic kind of stuff, crime-based. So I was searching around on the internet for sort of something potentially interesting to write about. And I stumbled across this reference to the Leipzig war crime trials. And I'm like, oh, I've never heard of that. War crime trials after World War I? Are we sure? Okay. So I started reading this, and I, went from sort of astonishment to complete sort of chaos, realizing that one of the key cases at these trials involved a Canadian hospital ship called the Llandovery Castle, and it had been sunk, and there's a whole bunch of repercussions from that, which we'll be discussing. And I knew absolutely nothing about this. And again, like I said, I've read, both academic and sort of popular historical accounts. Pierre Burton's excellent books on the First World War come to mind. And, this event had never, I'd never seen any mention of this event before. So originally I was going to write a magazine article about it. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized that the aftermath of this incident was just incredible. It had a huge impact for decades to go. And I pitched my my publisher, Dunder & Press, and they just jumped on it. They said, yeah, that sounds like a fantastic topic. And so I ended up writing a book about it. And basically, I'm hoping to open people's eyes to two things. A largely forgotten Canadian wartime tragedy, I think, that needs more attention. And number two, the ramifications from this tragedy. As I mentioned, this had an enormous impact on the prosecution of war crimes. And I'm hoping to open people's eyes to both of those things.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. That's definitely what I want to get into is as you said, the ramifications, which are massive and still ongoing, which is really, I mean, obviously the First World War, as we call it, Canada, has ripples through Canadian society still to this day. But this is one that's had international impact.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we'll definitely get to that. But I wonder if you could just give us a quick rundown of what happened and all of that connected to the sinking itself.
Okay. The very brief thumbnail sketch is the Llandovery Castle was one of 5 hospital ships that the government of Canada used to transport very badly wounded Canadian servicemen from England back home to Canada to recuperate. And these were generally people who were so badly injured or sick, they were completely out of the military for good.
Yep.
Half the patients on the last transport to Halifax were amputee cases, for example. And under the Hague Conventions, these are pre-war treaties that Germany had signed, Great Britain had signed, almost all the powers fighting in the Great War had signed these, and they were still in effect. It said hospital ships are not supposed to be attacked. You can stop them, you can search them, but you can't attack them. And in return, hospital ships have to be painted white, brightly lit at night, can't carry any guns, can't carry any war supplies, and have to have big red crosses. So they're obvious for miles around as to what they are. So the Llandovery Castle had gone back and forth between England and Halifax several times, and it was returning to England on the night of June 27, 1918. It's approaching the coast of Ireland, and it's suddenly hit by a torpedo from German U-boat 86. And the sub had been stalking the Llandovery Castle for hours. The sub crew testified later that they knew it was a hospital ship. This was not a mistaken identity. They could tell from its lights it was a hospital ship, but they felt it was a legitimate target because they had this sort of cockeyed belief that it was transporting American pilots. And I explain that in the book. There's this whole bizarre thing that the Germans became convinced that the Allies were abusing hospital ships. There was a bit of validity to that in that the Lusitania, the passenger ship sunk in 1915, was indeed transporting war supplies, though the Allies denied it. And so what happened is the ship sinks, and there's a few lifeboats that managed to make it off the ship. The submarine is surfaced at this point and starts interrogating people. And it says, tell us the names of all the American pilots. And the survivors are like, what are you talking about? We're a hospital ship. There's no American pilots. And they interrogate a number of people, and everyone says the same thing. There's no pilots. It's an unarmed hospital ship. There's no guns. There's no war material on board. We're unarmed. We didn't provoke you in any way. And the sub-captain, Helmut Patzig, realizes at this point that he made a colossal mistake, and he's in violation of the Hague Conventions. So he essentially decides to kill all the survivors, all the witnesses to his war crime, and he starts shelling the lifeboats. And a single lifeboat with 24 survivors, there's 6 Canadian medical staff and 18 British crewmen, manages to escape. And 2 days later, that lifeboat is rescued by a British destroyer. The survivors are taken to England, and their story just triggers global outrage. Like what I said in my book is that even in the midst of this brutal war, some events still had the power to shock. And I collected headlines from around the world, United States, Australia, England, New Zealand, that just, Huns outdo themselves in vicious outrage. The notion of a submarine sinking a hospital ship was bad enough, but the medical staff included 14 female nurses, and these are called nursing sisters at the time. And so the notion of these nurses drowning and this sub shelling them, it just appalled the world. So it becomes this enormously shocking incident, and it actually motivates Canadian troops in the closing days of the war. They remember the Llandovery Castle becomes the battle cry of Canadian soldiers at the Battle of Amiens, like remember the Alamo, the American equivalent. And this is somewhat ironic because this is a ship that was on a healing mission, but it becomes this, there were speeches about it in the British House of Commons. The Canadian prime ministers weighed in on it. Winston Churchill made some remarks about it. He's Minister of Munitions at the time. So it really was this global sensation at the time that it sank.
Yeah, it definitely was a huge international, like you said, international attention. I really appreciated that part about the book was obviously with your journalistic background, but that research that you did into those titles and into those articles, because sometimes, and I say this a lot on my channel, is sometimes we get a little siloed and we just Canada. We don't try to do a broad focus. So I appreciate you doing that and looking at it. I mean, obviously this is the empire and they're all still a little more connected than we are today, but to see that, but especially in the US as well, which obviously the Lusitania had massive impact in that country. I mean, it's one of the reasons that is literally quoted for going to war.
Absolutely.
So it was good to see that. That's okay. Good timing. It allows me to pull something up in the book because I'm not sure that everyone's seen it. I've used this war bonds poster in the class I taught about the First World War. So that's the sub. This is from the book. So this is the sub.
Yeah, it was used in some propaganda and.
Oh, we lost you there, Nate. You might have to go out and come back in if you can hear me. So in here, I'll just look. Well, hopefully Nate gets this figured out. There's another one here. It's not the best. on here, but yeah, he's frozen. Hopefully he can get in touch with me. And nope. Sorry, it's not the best here, but it's another one that's a little more involved. I can see if I can find it later, but yeah, it's used for propaganda versus, and then also used at the Battle of Amiens. Let's see if I can get a hold of him. Oh, he's disappeared. Hopefully he comes back. And there's, while we have a minute here, if you're not already, please consider becoming a Patron YouTube channel member so we can keep doing these things. Links to buy the book down below are included, and all that good stuff as well to the merch. I do recommend the book. It's excellent looking at the various events leading to this and the German policy, which we'll get into a little bit, but things like that. And then also looking at the aftermath. All right, we're back. Okay. So what was I saying? Yes, I just quickly showed them the propaganda posters and all of that. So yeah, I use that to help teach the war.
Sure.
And how it became part of. Can't remember exactly, and I got to find it again. But I know it was used like as a battle cry, but it was also used as literally a launch code. I think it was for 2nd Division. I can't remember.
Yeah,
something like that. It was literally used, and it's documented because we can see the war diaries. But anyway, so yes, so the nursing sisters obviously has a massive impact. I mean, that's a big part of the war. Is in a lot of ways for the Western Allies is to protect femininity, right? You have the whole thing with Belgium. All presented by females and all of that. So obviously it has a major impact. Well, we had some questions while we were having some issues there. I wonder if you could answer a few questions while we're at that.
Of course.
We're talking about like the actual impact. So Fighting Canuck here is asking if there's any big changes to hospital ships, how they operated after Britannic was sunk.
Oh, okay. Well, the Britannic was actually sunk before the Llandovery Castle. The Llandovery Castle was kind of the last straw in some ways. Prior to the Llandovery Castle sinking, as I said, hospital ships were painted white. They did not go into convoys. That was an interesting thing, that they generally traveled solo. And after the Llandovery Castle was sunk, there were serious discussions about rescinding some of these rules, about painting hospital ships gray, just like any other ship, maybe even having them in a protective convoy. But essentially, the war ended before any of this could come to fruition. There was one other major hospital ship sunk after the Llandovery Castle, an Australian hospital ship. I think the Matilda. I'd have to double check on that name. So the Llandovery Castle was not the only hospital ship sunk. There, as the person who just asked the question mentioned, the Britannica. There was this whole list of ships, about a dozen hospital ships altogether. And the German Admiralty issued a policy permitting attacks on hospital ships in parts of the Mediterranean and the English Channel to the North Sea, under the guise that the Allies were using hospital ship privileges. And just to note, though, the Llandovery Castle wasn't anywhere near these sites.
Yeah.
But again, the commander decided on his own prerogative to attack the ship.
Yeah, I mean that policy. I mean is not. I mean it's horrible, but it's not unsurprising given the unrestricted submarine.
Correct.
Germany launches twice technically. They launch first and then pause it, and then.
That's right.
Which also brings the Americans in. So it's not unsurprising, but it is interesting that they got this idea in their head of that these are being used for. Like you've mentioned already, and I want to come back to it because there's another question connected to that. Of
course.
But of the flyers, the American flyers especially, which is interesting. But then the war supplies, and then there was questions about stuff going on in the Channel as well, and Germans getting confused about what uniforms meant and all of that stuff.
Right, exactly.
As well. But that leads. Sorry, I just got to find it again. I'm moving all over the place here. So this is, I don't know, but this is a good question. Was there a source of intelligence that caused the U-boat commander to indicate the presence of alleged Allied pilots?
Okay. Two-part answer, just bear with. There were reports in 1918 that the Germans had received information from spies in Halifax. This was actually reported in the New York Times. So this is not just sort of scuttlebutt, low-level scuttlebutt. This is, New York Times is reporting on this. The Germans did have a very extensive espionage networks in the United States, even before the war. So it's not beyond question to think they might have had some sort of activity in Canada. Having said that, there's a theory which I espouse in my book that the Germans got confused, that there used to be a method where Americans, before the United States joined the war effort, there was an effort, Americans who wanted to go to Europe and fight, would sometimes pay for their own travel on a passenger ship, go to Europe, and then join the Air Force. And the theory is the Germans somehow got this mixed up with passenger ship, hospital ship, and thought the policy was still in effect even after America joined the war. And just to explain a little background, the Germans at this point are getting increasingly paranoid because the British are sending out what's called Q ships. And these are disguised warships. They're disguised to look like a really rundown, crappy tramp steamer falling apart. And they'll even send a distress. Oh, can we come close to you? We're, low on oil. They get as close as they could to a submarine, and then the guns would come out and they blow it to bits. And the Germans thought this was really underhanded. So there was this paranoia among the German Admiralty that the Allies were up to no good. And all of this sort of came together in the Llandovery Castle case with this absolute conviction that, there's American pilots on this ship.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting part too. And because you talk about it in the book briefly, if I'm remembering correctly, but this is the point of the war where the German spring offensives have
correct,
more or less failed to reach their objective of splitting the Allies and trying to get that. Just in your research, and I know you mentioned talking about, you looked at the commander's logbook. I can't remember. I never remember the naval terms. I think it's logbook.
Yeah.
Was there any indication of anything of your research or anybody you talked to that sort of panic in that time period between the spring offensives failing and before really the Allies really start to push back right in late July, early August? Does that kind of play into this a little bit?
It plays into it in terms of, by this point in the war, late June 1918, Germany in general is getting desperate, period. Because, as you mentioned, the land offensives had largely failed. I believe there still was another offensive in July, but that didn't really get off the ground.
Yeah, very small.
The big spring offensives with the stormtroopers and infiltration tactics, great gains at first, and then by that point was being, wiped out. The Americans are actually pouring into the battlefield. That people sometimes underestimate the impact, but the United States was just sending hundreds of thousands of troops over. So among the Navy, there was this sense that we've got to sink as many ships as possible, especially American troop ships, before these guys come and tip the balance in Europe. And there's also a naval blockade. The British have a naval blockade on German ports, preventing merchant ships from distributing food. So there's a lot of hunger in Germany. Civilians are actually near starvation. There's several thousand died. Malnutrition, starvation, deprivation. And the German leaders realize that, they cannot continue this war for very much longer unless there's some decisive victory. So again, all of that fed into this sort of super aggressive at the later trial, which we'll discuss about the Llandovery Castle. Several German naval figures testified that towards that period, towards the end of the war, these submarine commanders were getting more and more aggressive. And nobody really said, okay, you've got to be super aggressive. It was just they felt that they had to do, sink as many ships as possible, throw the rule book out the window. Like, this is really, getting into, this is our last chance to really prevail.
Yeah, I mean, I get that sense too. And from the things I've looked at as well, I mean, outside of this is the desperation. There's no other way to put it.
Absolutely.
Like you said, the Americans are pouring in, and the French are getting back on their feet after the disastrous 1917. So it's really, they are panicking. So we have a question as well from James.
Sure.
But I want to ask this in kind of two parts, if that's okay. So James just asked, was there any evidence of hospital ships carrying arms? So I want to ask this in a two-part way. Was there any evidence during the war that the Germans had in any way, shape, or form that might have happened? And did you come across any evidence of that happening or learn about that from after the war? if you don't.
Okay. The answer is no and no, that I couldn't come across any evidence of hospital ships carrying arms. I am not going to rule it out definitively because there was some murky business going on. As I mentioned, the Lusitania was carrying war material. It admittedly not a hospital ship, but the Allies did lie about what was the cargo. Yeah. There was an incident I talk about on the Llandovery Castle where a patient tried to smuggle souvenir swords on board. Yeah. I think he'd stole them off a German officer, and this caused a huge uproar. There's a series of memos which I read going up and down the chain of command. How could this happen? Oh, this is terrible. So they're that concerned about violating the Hague Convention. When the ship docked in Halifax for the last time, it was inspected twice before anyone could disembark. There's a guy named Dr. Harold Kerr comes on board. He's an official, and he has to inspect everything to ensure it's living up to Hague standards. And he inspects the ship again before it leaves port on its final voyage to England, and that's where it was torpedoed. So I could not uncover anything that suggested hospital ships were breaking the rules. Again, like I said, I hate to make a definitive statement because the British, like I said, were using these Q ships. There was some unethical behavior on both sides of the struggle. But I don't think there was anything to justify German paranoia about hospital ships per se.
Yeah, I think that, never want to be definitive as a historian.
Right.
For sure. You don't want to say unless you know, right? Especially for something like that. There's always going to be that one thing that comes out of the woodwork in 50 years. But this isn't, because primarily my audience is interested in the Second World War. So this isn't quite to that level, but once the Americans get on board, there's a lot more shipping than there used to be. So it doesn't really make sense to put rifle rounds or shells onto a hospital ship. So.
No, and again, by June of 1918, the Americans have their own troop ships.
Yeah.
So why would they need to transport American flyers on Canadian hospital ships?
Yeah, it's
like we're going to send the guys by train to Halifax, and then they have to board a ship, fill out paperwork. And then what? They go to Europe and somehow it doesn't make any sense. But again, we're dealing with people who are, by this point, getting a little bit sort of crazy from the war effort.
Yeah. And this is actually a good question to lead into where I want to go next. Is Patsik, so the commander, being asked here by Michael if they have a private motive for killing. I don't know if there's any, a relative is killed or the family starving or anything like that.
I couldn't find any private motive for the killing. My impression was just that, he wasn't a sadist. I did not get any indication that, he just enjoyed inflicting horrible pain. I think he was just simply an obedient soldier who figured that he'd made a terrible mistake and this is the best way to deal with it. Keep in mind, I should have mentioned, Llandovery Castle was not able to send a distress message.
Right.
The telegraph equipment in the Marconi room had been damaged. No one knew this ship had been attacked except the people on the Llandovery Castle and the people in the sub. So the commander kind of puts two and two together and says, well, if we get rid of the traces, maybe no one will know about it. And as I mentioned in the book, there was a court case in the Second World War of almost the exact same thing happening. Of a German U-boat sinks a ship and then tries to destroy all traces of humans and floating debris and such. So it's not. He took a sort of a cold-blooded calculation and just said, "Okay, I want to get rid of anyone who could possibly say anything." And he, after the sinking, he gathers his men in the control room of the sub and tells them, "Look, what has happened is I will take upon my conscience before God. But you will say nothing about it." And he alters. We mentioned Captain Patsik they have a war diary, which details his patrol. He doesn't mention anything about sinking the Llandovery Castle. He lists all the ships he sank on the patrol. Llandovery Castle is not on it. And he even draws a fake chart of his supposed route, which goes nowhere near the little bit of near the Irish coast where he sank the Llandovery Castle. So he's very openly lying about what he did and trying to cover up his tracks. So I think this is just simply a cold-blooded way to cover his tracks. I don't think there was any personal motive or sadism involved.
Yeah, so I just said this is a very specific question, but it just popped into my head because all the things, all the evidence that you found is the torpedoes, right? You talk about that and how they're expensive and dangerous to use because you have to go underwater and go slow, and it's better to get done, all that good stuff. Did you come across, was there any accounting for the torpedoes? Did they say, we launched 2 and 1 hits, and did they have to do anything like that? Or was it never down to that kind of level on the German side?
Yeah, well, these war diaries are super specific, and they do actually talk about torpedoes being launched, etc. The war diary itself is dozens of pages in German, which was somebody nicely translated it for me.
Which is great.
Which call out for the chap who runs the website uboat.net.
Yes,
that definitely helped me. And if memory serves, he basically fudged the bit about the torpedoes. That he didn't come quite out and say, he didn't come quite out and lie, but he kind of hedged and hoping no one would look too deeply into his use of these, extremely expensive weapons.
Yeah, especially at that time, given the, like you said, the blockade.
Yeah.
So I want to launch into, because that's why I was asking about Pat Safe was a good segue. I want to talk about the trial,
of course,
which a lot of people don't know about.
No,
I didn't learn about that until a few years back when I was really getting into this stuff. But okay, so November 11, 1918, war's over. Can you kind of walk us through how we can get to a German-led war crimes trial?
Sure. Okay, well, November 11th is just the armistice, as of course you know. Yep. And so the war really truly ends with the Treaty of Versailles. And one of the stipulations in the Treaty of Versailles is war crime trials. The Allies say we want to put the German military and political figures and put them on tribunals and subject them to war crime trials. There's a few problems with this. Existing treaties like the Hague Convention didn't really explain how to prosecute war crimes, and no one had really done this on a big scale. Like, this was really unique. And the second problem was the post-war government in Germany. You've got to keep in mind, it's very shaky. There's terrorism on both the left and the right, and they're extremely nervous about handing over German figures to be tried in front of Allied military tribunals. So Berlin suggests a compromise. Hey, you guys want war crime trials? Germany will host them. We'll do them before the German Supreme Court, which is in Leipzig. Germany will handle both the prosecution and the defense. And the Allies, you guys give us a list of people you want to be tried, the evidence and witnesses. So the Allies kind of grumble about this, but you got to remember, the Allies are not playing with a strong hand because they don't occupy Germany.
No.
That's one of the things that sometimes gets forgotten. At the end of World War I, there's an armistice. The German army marches home. So the Allies are not in Germany, except a couple sort of border areas. So they're really at the mercy of, the Germans having to cooperate in this, unlike the Second World War, where the Allies occupied the whole country. So they sort of grumble and there's some negotiation, but eventually the Allies agree. So the Leipzig war crime trials begin in the spring of 1921. And the Allies initially had a list of about 800 names of people they wanted to put on trial. They can't try the Kaiser because he's gone off to Holland, and Holland refuses to extradite him. They initially have this list of, Hindenburg and Ludendorff and all these top leaders, and it gradually gets whittled down to like this, maybe 20 names or something. And one of the cases is the Llandovery Castle. And the interesting thing about this case is that the judges focus solely on the shelling of the lifeboats, not the sinking of the ship.
Yeah, right.
And the other bizarre thing about the trial is the guy who ordered the shelling can't be located because Captain Danzig has gone back to, Captain Patzig has gone back to Danzig, his hometown. And in this sort of complicated post-Treaty of Versailles order, Danzig is now an independent, free city.
Right.
It's out of the jurisdictional reach of both Germany and the Allies. So he's out of reach. So what are the Germans are under huge pressure by this point because so far the trial has, there's been some very minor guys put on trial. They're usually given a slap on the wrist or outright acquitted. The British are outraged. The French are outraged. So the Germans very hastily arrest 2 lieutenants who helped with the shelling. And they're charged with attempted murder. And in court, they're defiant. They say, we obeyed our orders. We're not guilty. And everyone expects them to be acquitted. But the German Supreme Court on July 16, 1921, surprises everyone and convicts them. And in doing so, they released this incredible statement. This ruling is really quite, amazing for the era, especially given it's a German court trying German citizens. And they make 2 incredibly important precedents. And number 1 is that there's sort of an international standard for war crimes. It doesn't matter what the German Admiralty said. It doesn't matter what national law says. There's sort of international norms and values. They say that firing on the lifeboats was an offense against the law of nations, meaning that any country in the world would recognize this is wrong. And the second incredibly important thing they recognize is that obedience to orders is not a defense for committing illegal acts in wartime. So if you are ordered to commit an obvious criminal offense, and the judges make this clear, they're not talking about some nuanced thing like there's a street fight and, okay, you're ordered to machine gun, down the street and some civilians get killed. No, they're talking about a very specific situations. Like the example I use is like if you're ordered, go throw those grenades in that orphanage. Yeah. Something that is so blatantly, obviously wrong and criminal, you have the right to disobey. And these lieutenants at the least could have disobeyed the order or at least reported it. Mm-hmm. Like if they feared for their life, they could have said, well, we would have been shot if we didn't obey this, but at least they could have told somebody once, they got home. So the judges established this ruling. And the problem is at the time, almost no one pays attention because the 2 lieutenants are only given 4 years in jail apiece. They quickly escape with the help of friends. And the whole Leipzig trials comes to a grinding halt, and they're regarded as a total failure. The British completely lose interest in the trials. France and Belgium hold a bunch of trials in absentia, meaning they couldn't even get the German defendant in court, but they want to do it anyway. And by the middle of the 20s, everyone wants just to forget about it. And eventually what happens is the Nazis take power in 1933, and they just end any war crime prosecutions are over. And Pat and the 2 lieutenants were eventually acquitted.
Yeah, can I stop you there? Because I got 2 things I want to talk about because this is a good question. So you mentioned in passing, escaped. Can you talk about that a little bit just for a minute? I don't want to give away too much because it's in the book and I think it's done very well in the book. Mm-hmm. But that is like, wait a second, like they literally escaped.
Well, the New York Times put it. They said they described the escapes as suspicious. Mm-hmm. And even papers as far as afield as the New York Times suggested that they had some assistance, that the jailers and the wardens, the governors, were basically in league with. There was very right-wing nationalistic German veterans groups, sort of precursor embryonic Nazis in a way, and huge amount of sympathy for these 2 lieutenants. You got to understand, they were not seen as villains in Germany. They were seen as victims. So let's just say they didn't strain themselves to break out. It's not like they dug a tunnel and spent months burrowing.
They didn't Dufresne their way out, that's for sure.
No, there's the details on the actual escape are a bit vague, to be honest. I couldn't find a huge amount. It basically said that, they got out of jail and we think that some people helped them. And that was about the extent of it. I suspect someone just literally opened the door. And
I would assume so, or even if they didn't want to, I assume very militant veterans group said, open the door or otherwise.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So Alice, before we move on to what comes later, I want to touch on one thing, because one thing that I found interesting about Patzig is, like we said, it's confusing. He went to Danzig because that's where he's from.
Yeah, right.
It becomes a free city, but there's Polish administration in Danzig. Did they not? Was there no? You may never have even come across any of this, but was there no willingness on their part to do anything? Because it's not exactly like they're fans of the Germans, you know?
No, there was just, you'd be surprised that after the war ended, a lot of countries kind of gave up in terms of the whole Leipzig war crime trials. The United States had almost no participation in the trials at all.
Right.
Which is why there was no court case about Lusitania. Like you'd think that would be a natural for the Leipzig war crime trials. Nope, wasn't there. I have a list of other countries that really didn't participate. I think Italy was on there. But yeah, Poland. Keep in mind, Poland also at this time has issues with the Soviet Union.
True.
Like their early 20s, they're a little distracted.
A little bit.
So as far as I could tell, no real attempt by the Poles to sort of grab Dawne's, Patzig and bring him to justice.
Yeah, I figured as much. I had to ask because that
makes sense. Makes
one
sense.
in my head. This is even pre-39. They still are, not the biggest fans of the Germans.
No.
That makes sense. So moving on now. So we hit. You mentioned the Nazis come to power. This all goes away. They're literally acquitted. It's all basically disappears. Patzig rejoins the German Navy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that is a fascinating. That could be its own thread of all kinds of things connected through there. But what I do want to talk about is obviously what the Germans do during the Second World War.
Right.
Well covered on my channel. This is not a surprise to anybody here. But afterwards, the if that's okay, we can jump straight to Nuremberg.
Of course.
What's going on here, and if you can speak to that, that would be great.
Sure. Well, during the Second World War, one of the things the prosecutors wanted to do is we wanted to do a new war crime trials and avoid all the mistakes of the Leipzig war crime trials. So number one, these are going to be run by Allied military tribunals, not a German court. And number two, we're going to try to have some more powerful weapons to use, legal weapons to use in this battle. And so they searched through various, case files. And the Leipzig verdict, prosecutors realized this hands prosecutors a golden opportunity to rebut two of the main defenses that they know are coming and turned out to be exactly what the Nazis used, which are number one, I was just following orders. Yep. Number two, international standards don't apply in the Third Reich. And now prosecutors have this hugely powerful rebuttal to that, and it's from a German court. And that makes an enormous difference because it's not like, some court in New York City that did this, blah, blah, blah. This is, a court of German justices, and it is used repeatedly in the Charter of the International Military Tribunal. And this is the group that tries the top Nazi leadership. The principle that superior orders is not a defense is right in the Charter. It's one of the main points. It's not allowed to be used as a defense except in mitigation of sentencing. This is actually mentioned I actually downloaded an entire transcript of the entire trial, and it comes up because Generals Jodl and a few others, Keitel, tried to use the I was just following orders defense, and it's noted by the judges that we're not, this isn't even worthy of consideration. And it comes up.
Sorry, I just got to jump in because just at that level, that's bonkers to me.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just that they knew that precedent was there because
right.
They knew this was coming, and yet they still tried it. It just boggles my mind.
Oh, absolutely. And what I found fascinating is the more I dug, the more I realized that the Leipzig precedent was cited at a whole bunch of other trials.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize Nuremberg trials of the top leadership was only one of a whole series of trials. So the precedent, the Llandovery Castle precedent is cited at, I had a British trial in Hamburg for a U-boat that sunk a Greek transport called the Palouse. The crew tried to murder survivors and they claim, we were ordered to. The tribunal says, no, Llandovery Castle case. It comes up in an American military tribunal, the 1947 Einsatzgruppen trial. Yeah. These are SS death squad members tried with mass murder. One of their defenses, we were just following orders. We had a Führer order, a direct order from the Führer, so international standards don't count. And Brigadier General Telford Taylor just quashes that and he cites the Llandovery Castle case. He says, Soldiers do not have to obey palpably criminal orders. This principle was established in Leipzig in the Llandovery Castle case. And interestingly enough, it was also cited at the Kharkov war crime trials,
Right.
which was the very first war crime trials of World War II with Nazi defendants. And it's actually during the war, late 1943. 3 Germans and a collaborator are put on trial by a Soviet military tribunal, and they mention the Llandovery Castle. So I was a bit astonished to discover that this case repeatedly came up at trials, mainly because the defendants kept repeatedly going back to the same time-worn excuses. I was just following orders. What could I do? And it's now, well, I'll tell you what you could have done. This is what a German court said in 1921. So it becomes this hugely powerful weapon. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, was that just so few people know. Almost everyone is familiar with the concept from Nuremberg of just following orders is not a defense for war crimes. But very few people know where that concept came from. And it came from a Canadian hospital ship and a court case about that hospital ship.
Yeah, it's. I was just thinking about that too, because I think it was also used. I can't remember if it was or not, but with the Japanese war crime trials as well.
It was mentioned in the Japanese war crime trials, but not as much impact because a totally different court system, and it wasn't a Japanese court that came up with the ruling, and there were some other issues about obedience to the emperor and all this other thing. So I did investigate that.
Oh, okay.
I did look at the Japanese war crime trials, and I did see a few references to Llandovery Castle, but not nearly as much. It's almost mostly a European.
Yeah, it's a different set of circumstances for the Japanese trials. And I mean, I've talked about that on this channel before with the Canadian involvement in Hong Kong. Anyway, I was just going to say, because it's funny you mentioned that, because that's how I found out about the Llandovery Castle.
Oh,
actually.
okay. Interesting.
Yeah, but no, I wasn't Nuremberg. I think it might have been the one at Hamburg. I can't remember. One of the ones connected to it, and it's mentioned, as the precedent. Like, I think I remember, they took out a hospital ship, but that's one of the themes of World War I, right? Is the German unrestricted campaign. So I was like,
exactly,
okay, that makes sense. But like people are saying in the sidebar here, they had no idea that this set a precedent that is of that scope, which is still ongoing, right? It was used in Canada. What's the case you used the example of? It was in early 2000s, wasn't it?
Yes, there was a court case of a Hungarian gentleman who had been involved with the Hungarian paramilitary police during World War II. Without getting too complicated, Hungary fights for the Nazis, changes sides, and then is invaded by the Germans as sort of retribution. The Holocaust is expanded to Hungary, with the Jewish population of Hungary being rounded up. This gentleman was accused of participating in that, of being one of the gendarmes, and he comes to Canada, declares citizenship. He goes through all these trials, and eventually, I should mention, he was acquitted.
Yes.
And it was a very controversial decision, but basically they suggested that there just simply wasn't enough solid evidence to prove in a court of law. And I stress that because it seemed pretty obvious that, he admitted he was involved with the Hungarian police, admitted to being involved in rounding up Jewish civilians. He just denied abusing them or killing them in any way. And it was the Llandovery Castle, again, is mentioned in one of these court decisions.
Yeah.
And in that case, it was sort of a very convoluted reference, though. I found it a bit confusing that the guy was basically saying in cases where in some cases soldiers don't have to obey these orders, but the Hungarian gentleman thought his life was in danger and was convinced that the Jewish people were plotting against the government and letting in communists. It was a bit of a weird argument. But it surprised me because this was only 2 decades ago, and the Llandovery Castle was again becomes a legal reference.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this a lot, but Canada does not have the best record when it comes to prosecuting war criminals.
No,
and I'm not even talking about just the Second World War, but that can be for another time. That just adds to that pile, which is big enough as it is. So another part of your book, and you probably don't know this about me, but I like looking at remembrance of war and what that form takes and how that changes over time. And it was really interesting that you cover that in your book.
Thank you.
How it's done in the immediate period afterwards, right? Like, I mean, the one of the nursing sisters has a hospital named after her.
Yeah, Rena McLean.
Which is really interesting because that was kind of like, common at the time to remember that. And then there's, unfortunately, can't see it right now because it's under construction, but then there's a statue or a carving, technically, in center block in Parliament.
Yeah.
Can't see it right now. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so you talked about the centenary of Llandovery Castle and all of that. Could you talk about that a little bit? And then I got another question for you.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah, just to give a quick nutshell, immediately after the war, there's a lot of church commemorations about the Llandovery Castle. A few plaques go up. Right. There's you mentioned the engraving in the center block in the Parliament Hill. Llandovery Castle is often mentioned in tributes to nurses, and then it sort of becomes forgotten. And I discuss that in my book. I don't know. I don't have enough time to go into detail, but eventually the Llandovery Castle fades from memory. Yeah. And there's a revival and interest in it towards the 100th anniversary of the sinking. The Canadian military did some lovely tributes to Llandovery Castle. I had the honor of interviewing one of the chaplains who organized and helped with one of these tributes. And very importantly, a composer named Stephanie Martin. She's rehearsing in a church and she just wanders around and notices this plaque on the wall. And it's dedicated to Mary Agnes McKee, who nursing sister, died in Llandovery Castle in 1918. And it just stops her short because Stephanie is a person who reads a lot of history, never heard of this case, like me, starts investigating and decides to write an opera about it. She's written operas before. She hooks up with a guy named Paul Ciuffio, who writes, who's I was going to say lyricist, but that's not the right word. When you write operas, it's librettist. He writes words for opera, and they join forces and they come up with this beautiful opera commemorating the Llandovery Castle, and it debuts in Toronto at a church in the 100th anniversary. And then they do it's sort of a bare bones production in Toronto. They invite descendants of people who were on the ship to attend. And then in early 2020, just before COVID hits, Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, my hometown, by the way, puts on a full costume, full lighting, full set version of the opera. And it's just spectacular. You can look it up on YouTube. Just enter WOU Llandovery Castle Opera, and they have sets. They have incredible visuals. The music is brilliant. The singing is brilliant. It tells there's a story arc. It focuses mostly on the nurses. That's the point of human interest, and a couple of the male medical staff. And Captain Patzig is kind of the villain of the piece, obviously, but it's absolutely spectacular. And I just thought, what a wonderful way to remember this bit of Canadian history. And if anyone out there is thinking they should, maybe restage it across the country or something.
That was going to be my
intent.
Yeah, that was going to be my next thing is because when I got to that part of the book and then I saw the date, I went, oh no, because it's like, well, it was literally February, I think, and it's like, it was where that's going to go. So that was the part that kind of struck me is, and kind of working my way to the question here of the commemoration, particularly because I remember quite a bit. Well, it wasn't that long ago, but the centenary, right, of the First World War in general. There was a lot more of, how do I put this? More, I don't know what the word is. More like things like operas and songs and plays and things like that. I was wondering if, and how you came across this. Was that something you noticed too? Was that more common? Because I'm sure you came across more than just what was covered with the Llandovery Castle.
You mean, sorry, in terms of the opera?
Sorry, if there was other commemorations, like if that was a theme you saw, or
okay, sure,
plays and things like that. Yeah.
Yes, there was CBC Radio did a lovely radio show. I don't know if not a radio play, I guess a radio documentary about the Llandovery Castle that touched on the opera. It kind of used the opera as sort of a springboard to talk about the ship, the sinking, interview descendants of survivors. It was really, really powerful, very well done. Just want to give a call out to the CBC there. So there were a few things like that, and there were some commemorative articles in newspapers and things like that. But that is about it. There were some, high-profile commemorative pieces. As far as I know, there weren't any sort of big TV documentaries or anything.
No, and I mean, I think I could be wrong, but I don't think there isn't, or there is any plans to do more of those traditional statue carving, whatever type of commemorations for this. I don't think so.
No, not as far as I know.
Yeah, because I mean, other than the one, like I said, in center block at Parliament, probably as much as it's going to happen, because I know it can be fraught with all kinds of things.
Yeah,
trying to do these kinds of commemorations, particularly in Ottawa, where I live, it's a little bit complicated. But anyway, it's a shame that there's not something separate. I mean, in that sense, because especially with, I mean, it's cool because I have seen it when I toured Parliament, but you can't visit it. It's not easy to get to. It's a shame there isn't like somewhere to go other than the Halifax Memorial, which has those with no number.
Right.
But that's it. So we have a question actually from one of the. If anybody else has any more questions, that would be great. Just for a few more minutes. And in your research, that's from David here, one of our good supporters of the channel, is were there any other questionable sinking of other Canadian or Canadian connected merchant vessels in World War I?
I came across a few, but I can't sort of speak specifically to that because I was just focused almost solely on the Llandovery Castle. I do know that there was, how would I put it, questionable sinkings of lots of other merchant ships, not necessarily Canadian, especially towards the end of the war. As I said, the German subfleets really sort of just started shooting at just about anything that moved. There were specific rules that you weren't supposed to sink neutral ships. Holland, for example, was neutral. Right. You weren't supposed to sink a ship with a Dutch flag. Some of them got sunk anyway. So it was part of that, but I can't speak to any specific incidents. If you're asking me for the name of a
no. I mean, it's just if there's anything, but I don't think so, because the biggest one is Halifax, is the Halifax explosion that really covers the. Yeah. I mean, it's horrible, but it's not as much because there isn't as much Canadian shipping at the time. That doesn't come until the second one. But this is one thing we forgot to mention is survivors. Canadian survivors specifically.
There was one lifeboat, as I mentioned, survived. So there's 24 people survived. The ship carried 258 people originally. Okay, so British crew and 94 members of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. And those medical corps included 14 female nurses. All the nurses died, and almost everyone else did too. 24 people survived the attack, and that was 6 Canadians and 18 British men, including the captain of the ship. Captain Sylvester survived. And I got to interview the grandson of one of the survivors, Arthur Knight. Right. And Arthur Knight had a very special role because he was in the lifeboat with the nurses. Their lifeboat capsized and all the nurses drowned, and Sergeant Knight almost drowned as well. He's rescued and is he's the only witness to the nurses' last moments, and he attributes their bravery and stoicism. So that, yes, there were survivors, and I was, like I said, it was an honor to be able to speak to the descendants of some of these survivors.
Yeah, there wasn't that many, and we'll leave the rest for the people to read in the book, because it is part of all of the things that we talked about. So it's an important part. So yeah, you've looks like you've inspired a few of our viewers to learn more about the World War I U-boat war.
Yes.
Lots on the second, but First World War has a lot of similarities, but its own complexity in a lot of ways. Those unrestricted campaigns are thorny, let's put it that way. With having the U.S. being out of the war at the time. So question for me. Overall, I know you said you've done a lot of true crime and historical based, because I was looking at some of your other ones you had done, and not an area I get into much, because I tend to focus on what I do. But any more any more projects, any military history projects on the horizon, possibly?
I have lots of ideas, but I'm taking a bit of a break from books just to focus on promoting this one. Number one, because, well, frankly, I think it's my best book, so I want to promote it, and I want to get the message out about the Llandovery Castle. Also, just to give myself a bit of a break. This one was super intense to write.
I bet.
My girlfriend and I went to Ottawa we went to Library Archives Canada, looked up like boxes and boxes of old memos. Went to the War Museum. That was incredible. I got to hold in my hands the diary of one of the survivors, a guy named Corporal William Pilot. And he put together a diary after he was rescued, and very matter of fact, and then we were torpedoed and the ship went down, and I'm holding this in my hand. So it was a wonderful experience, but also like super, mentally exhausting. By the way, if anyone out there is doing research, Library and Archives Canada is your friend. They have digitized service records from the First World War, and because it's over 100 years old, they're now publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
All you have to do is, the name of someone who served in the Canadian military First World War or their regimental number. You enter it on their website. You get the entire record, 100 pages sometimes.
Yep.
So that was invaluable for my research. Had this happened in the Second World War, it would have been much more difficult to research. But no, I have plenty of other ideas, but I'm kind of taking a bit of a breather on some of this.
Yeah, can't say I blame you. I have many things on the go myself, so taking a breather is always appealing, especially when you're doing something this intense. And I know because I do a lot of research with those institutions.
Absolutely.
It can be a lot, and it can be not the easiest thing to do. So that said, I got my copy. So everyone, there's links down below.
Thank you.
It's a great way of covering the story. I didn't want to, when you emailed me, I didn't want to read anything about it because I just wanted to take it as it comes, not to have any, preconceptions or whatever. But I really appreciate how you did the sinking first, if that makes sense, because then you talked about everything that comes after and the precedent that's set and the commemoration. You often don't see those blended together in history books.
No, it
doesn't happen that way.
It took me a while to figure out how to structure the book because there is one of the odd things about this book is there was so much material. Usually when I do a project, the issue is there's not enough material. And this was a case where there was like almost too much. I won't quite say too much, but I mean, there was a huge amount of info. So I struggled quite a bit how to shape this. The original version, I started with a description of the ship being built in Scotland. It was a British passenger liner, got converted to a hospital ship. Very historical account, and the sinking didn't happen until chapter 2 or 3. And let's just say some beta readers suggested that was a bit dry and boring. So I just decided, okay, I'm going to start right off with the sinking, like literally in the first sentence, the torpedo hits the ship.
Yep.
Like that's the first sentence, and take it from there and sort of do the backstory, and then talk about the commemoration and the trials. I tried to. Maybe it's my journalism background. I try to, humanize it, focusing on the individuals, and try to make it as interesting as possible. I have read other accounts of bits and pieces of the Llandovery Castle story, and some of the accounts of the trial. There's some very good academic books about the Leipzig trials, but they're usually quite dry, boring, and kind of go off into huge amounts of detail about this or that memo, blah, blah, blah. I was trying to avoid that. I wanted to make it interesting and lively. This is a popular history book. It's not.
I mean, that's why I preach that on this channel all the time, is the popular history can be the way in and it can change things up. Because I was going to say, I don't think you were held back by some of the things that would say hold me back with that history background. You don't do that. You don't do it that way. You don't do that. We all get stuck in our ruts sometimes. So it's good to have different ways of looking at it. Other than that, hopefully the promotion of the book goes well. I think it's
thank you very much.
It's all well. It's very well deserved. I enjoyed the book. I'm going to come back to it because I want to look into a few things that you brought up, and
thanks.
Maybe I'll get the wheels turning for some videos or something in the future. But
great.
Other than that, if you do end up doing more, reach out. We'll
absolutely.
Yeah,
Well,
that'd be great.
it's a pleasure to go on shows like yours, Brad, with people who know about the, First World War, Second World War. That kind of helps. So I don't have to, give the baby primer about, the Germans did this and the British did that.
Yeah, we got a great audience here. They're very well.
Yeah. So I appreciate the opportunity, and always happy to come back. And yeah, please, everyone read the book or, find out more about Llandovery Castle. It's an important story in Canadian history.
Yep. So hopefully this show helps get the word out a little bit, and about your book, obviously, but also, again, I agree, the Llandovery Castle needs to be known about, and the precedent and all of that, and the story of the nurses and the medical and the crew and all of it. There's just so much there that needs to be known. So
absolutely.
So thanks again, Nate.
Thank you.
Yep. So other than that, everyone have a good night. There'll be some more live streams coming up in the next week or two, but keep an eye on socials and on here, and I'll be releasing those shortly, probably early next week. So other than that, everyone have a good rest of your night. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening.